You think manipulators are masterminds calculating, cold, always 3 moves ahead. But the truth is stranger. The people who manipulate most effectively are rarely the smartest in the room. They're desperate, emotional, reactive, and somehow they know exactly how to exploit your intelligence against you. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing in the ruthless courts of Renaissance Florence, saw this clearly, not as a cartoon villain, but as a penetrating observer of human behavior. His lesson is timeless: awareness beats raw intelligence. The paradox of manipulation and intelligence. Human social life conceals a paradox that has intrigued philosophers for centuries, yet remains largely unspoken in everyday conversation. It is the surprising reality that those who manipulate most effectively are rarely the most intelligent. This seems counterintuitive because our cultural imagination, fueled by stories, movies, and novels, presents manipulators as brilliant strategists. We picture individuals with razor-sharp intellects, precise psychological understanding, and an almost surgical mastery of language. These are people who seem to calculate every interaction, anticipate every reaction, and execute plans with a calm, almost terrifying precision. Yet, in reality, manipulation, the kind that quietly pervades families, workplaces, social networks, and political spheres, is seldom the result of meticulous intelligence. Instead, it often emerges from desperation, emotional immaturity, and impulsive improvisation. These manipulators do not have the patience or clarity to achieve their goals through reason, competence, or honesty. Their methods are reactive rather than reflective, opportunistic rather than principled. This distinction is crucial because of the way intelligent individuals tend to respond. When confronted with someone we assume is a calculating manipulator, we respond with analysis, caution, and self-examination. We scrutinize every word, every pause, every gesture. We try to anticipate motives and predict outcomes. In other words, we approach the situation as a problem to be solved. Meanwhile, the manipulator, often guided by fear, impulse, or a fragile sense of self, has already achieved the outcome they desired. They do not win through intellectual superiority. They win through creating a terrain where intelligence is ineffective. Machiavelli, observing the courts and republics of Renaissance Florence, understood this dynamic in a way that popular interpretations of his work often overlook. He did not depict human beings as rational actors whose behavior could be predicted by logic or morality. Instead, he observed them without flattery, without idealization, and without moral bias. He saw that most people operate under the influence of fear, desire, and the need to protect fragile social images. The philosophical question that emerges from this observation is precise. How is it that emotionally reactive, low-awareness individuals are able to manipulate people who, by conventional measures, possess far greater intelligence? And what does Machiavelli in his writings explicitly and implicitly teach about recognizing, understanding, and countering this phenomenon? Born in Florence in 1469, Machiavelli entered a world where political survival was not metaphorical. Leaders were deposed, exiled, or assassinated. Alliances were transient, lasting only as long as convenience dictated. The discrepancy between what rulers said and what they did was not a moral failing. It was a structural feature of life in the city-states of Italy. Machiavelli witnessed this world as a diplomat, a civil servant, and later as a prisoner of the very system he served. His observations produced a framework not for cruelty, as many critics have argued, but for seeing reality clearly and acting effectively within it. At the core of Machiavelli's philosophy is the understanding that human beings are driven primarily by fear and desire, not by reason or virtue. In The Prince, he writes that people are more likely to forget the death of a parent than the loss of inheritance. This statement is not cynical rhetoric, but a methodological principle. The study of human behavior must be grounded in observation of how people actually act, rather than how they should act according to moral theory. From this foundation, Machiavelli develops what can be called a psychology of perception. He emphasizes that in human affairs, appearances often matter more than reality. What others see is more consequential than what you truly are. Those who manage the perception of themselves wield influence over others, while those who fail to perceive the motives and deceptions of others find themselves at a perpetual disadvantage. Within this framework, manipulation is not necessarily a weapon of sophistication, but a survival mechanism for those lacking other forms of power. When an individual cannot persuade through reason, cannot command loyalty through competence, or cannot earn respect through genuine contribution, they turn to manipulation. They distort reality, create morally charged environments, and generate emotional turbulence to cloud judgment. They do not defeat the strong through intellect or authority, they disorient them through confusion. Understanding why intelligent individuals are disproportionately susceptible requires careful attention to the traits that define high-awareness people and how these traits, under certain conditions, can become vulnerabilities. These traits' commitment to logic, empathy, patience, and ethical seriousness normally function as strengths, but in a manipulative dynamic, they can be exploited with precision. The intelligent, ethical, and patient person is primed to assume good faith and to seek rational resolution. When faced with someone who has no interest in resolution, the very qualities that make them capable thinkers and compassionate beings become sources of exposure. Why intelligent people are vulnerable. To understand why intelligent individuals are often the targets of manipulation, we must examine the very qualities that define intelligence and ethical awareness, and how these traits can be leveraged against their possessor. Intelligence is not merely the capacity to solve problems or accumulate knowledge. It encompasses a set of cognitive and ethical habits, the pursuit of logical consistency, the exercise of empathy, the tolerance of ambiguity, and a commitment to fairness. Each of these traits, while powerful in ordinary circumstances, can be systematically exploited by those who operate without the constraints of rationality, ethics, or self-control. The first of these traits is a deep commitment to logic and coherence. Intelligent individuals naturally value consistency in reasoning. They choose positions carefully, weigh evidence, and build arguments that are defensible and precise. In daily life, this commitment allows them to solve complex problems, negotiate effectively, and communicate persuasively. But in the hands of a manipulator, logic becomes a trap. Someone unconcerned with coherence can contradict themselves without hesitation, shift positions on a whim, and make claims that are simultaneously absurd and compelling. The intelligent person attempting to track these contradictions becomes mentally exhausted. The manipulator does not need to win the argument on any rational basis. Their objective is to exhaust the opponent's capacity for structured thought. In a sense, the intelligent individual is playing a game of chess while the manipulator repeatedly flips the board. This dynamic illustrates a crucial point. Manipulation does not always require superior intellect. It requires an ability to disrupt and disorient the other person. Empathy is the second trait that renders intelligent individuals vulnerable. Deeply ethical and intelligent people instinctively consider the perspectives, emotions, and motivations of others. They extend interpretive charity, asking themselves whether they may have contributed to a conflict or whether a difficult behavior arises from genuine suffering. This is a powerful virtue in ordinary human interaction, fostering cooperation, trust, and moral insight. Yet manipulators exploit this very empathy. By performing distress, helplessness, or outrage, they trigger the compassionate response in the observer. Because authentic empathy cannot begin with suspicion, the intelligent person responds as if the manipulation were genuine suffering. Their moral and emotional attention is hijacked, steering their energy toward managing the manipulator's emotional landscape rather than exercising judgment. Patience, the third trait, also functions as a double-edged sword. Intelligent individuals can tolerate ambiguity and complexity longer than the average person. They are willing to sit with uncertainty and delay immediate action until the problem is understood. This patience is invaluable in research, ethical deliberation, and long-term decision-making. In manipulative interactions, however, patience becomes a form of exposure. A manipulator may prolong crises, introduce ambiguity, and delay resolution. the intelligent person, willing to invest time and energy in seeking understanding, becomes ensnared, sometimes over months or years, in an exhausting cycle of confusion and reaction. Finally, ethical seriousness, the commitment to fairness, justice, and moral rectitude, is particularly vulnerable to exploitation. Intelligent, principled people do not act arbitrarily. They strive to treat others equitably and assess situations conscientiously. Manipulators exploit this commitment by creating asymmetrical moral structures. Through repeated accusations of unfairness or by performing victimhood, they place the intelligent individual in a perpetual state of moral self-audit. Every action, every decision, and every response is scrutinized not only for its practical effects, but for its ethical adequacy. The manipulator gains power without explicit confrontation because the intelligent person internalizes the expectation to behave justly, even in a context where fairness cannot be guaranteed. Machiavelli would have observed all of these dynamics with clarity. In his political world, virtue without the capacity for self-defense was a liability. A ruler or courtier who projected ethical credibility but could not protect it became more dangerous than one without virtue. The same principle applies to contemporary social interactions. The intelligent, empathetic, and patient individual is extraordinarily capable, but only when interacting with others acting in good faith. When faced with individuals who operate impulsively, emotionally, or strategically in bad faith, these same qualities, if applied without discernment, can lead to disadvantage. This paradox explains why intelligence alone is insufficient protection against manipulation. The strategies of manipulators are often reactive rather than analytical. They rely on creating conditions under which rational thinking, empathy, ethical concern, and patience are ineffective. Emotional volatility, fabricated crises, performances of suffering, and moral posturing are not advanced strategies in the sense of deliberate calculation. They are effective precisely because they exploit the predictable virtues of intelligent people. These tactics work because intelligence is applied to the wrong terrain. When the landscape of interaction is defined by chaos, emotional exploitation, and social distortion, traditional intellectual tools fail. Awareness, rather than analytical skill alone, becomes the decisive resource. Understanding the vulnerabilities of intelligent individuals is only the first step. To respond effectively, one must recognize these patterns as they emerge, rather than assume that virtue, logic, or empathy will suffice. In Machiavelli's terms, the world is governed by fortune and perception as much as by rational calculation. Recognizing this, the intelligent person begins to shift focus from perfect ethical engagement in every interaction to disciplined observation of patterns, assessment of context, and control over one's own responses. Awareness transforms intelligence from a potential liability into a resilient tool, capable of navigating even the most destabilizing manipulative dynamics. The tactics of manipulation. Manipulation is rarely the product of genius. Instead, it often arises from emotional instability, insecurity, and reactive impulses. Yet these traits can have devastating effects on intelligent individuals. The manipulator's toolkit consists not of carefully calculated strategies, but of simple, repeatable behaviors that exploit the virtues of their targets. These behaviors operate by shaping the environment in ways that make rational thinking, ethical judgment, and deliberate reasoning ineffective. The first tool is emotional chaos. A manipulator will provoke unpredictability, anger, tears, indignation, forcing the other person to manage their shifting moods. Emotional turbulence dominates the interaction, turning the intelligent observer's cognitive resources toward immediate problem solving rather than analysis. Neuroscience supports this. When we respond to another's heightened emotional state, the prefrontal cortex responsible for deliberative thinking is suppressed. The manipulator, in contrast, remains reactive and unburdened, having already achieved their objective, control over attention and perception. In essence, emotional volatility creates a battlefield where intelligence is sidelined. The second tactic is the performance of victimhood. By casting themselves as perpetually wronged, oppressed, or suffering, manipulators hijack the moral imagination of others. Confronting or setting limits with such a person risks being perceived as cruel or unjust. This tactic generates a moral asymmetry. The manipulator occupies the protected position of sufferer, while the intelligent target is forced into perpetual self-scrutiny, seeking to avoid perceived harm. Every decision becomes ethically charged, and every action is weighed for its moral adequacy, draining energy and focus. Manufactured urgency is another powerful instrument. By insisting on immediate decisions, even in the absence of real crisis, the manipulator compresses time, forcing reliance on intuition rather than careful reasoning. Behavioral psychology shows that under time pressure, humans default to heuristics and instinctive judgments, which can be systematically exploited. The intelligent individual, who might otherwise take days to reach a sound conclusion, is denied the luxury of deliberation, and the manipulator benefits from premature and often suboptimal compliance. Social triangulation exploits humans' need for validation from others. A manipulator introduces or fabricates third-party perspectives to shift perception and create doubt. "Everyone agrees with me," or "I'm not the only one who thinks this," leverages social anxiety and epistemic caution, even when the claim is false. Intelligent people, who take seriously the observations of others, often grant undue weight to such statements, bending their judgment to accommodate the alleged consensus. Other tools include misrepresentation of arguments, energy attrition, and moral superiority. Misrepresentation involves twisting, exaggerating, or selectively quoting statements to create confusion, forcing the intelligent target into repeated clarifications that fail to resolve the distortion. Energy attrition is slower but no less effective. It exhausts the cognitive and emotional resources of the target through endless circular interactions, grievances, and demands. Moral superiority, finally, positions the manipulator as an ethical authority, making every action of others subject to implicit judgment. The intelligent observer, seeking to act with integrity, inadvertently validates this power structure by engaging in moral accounting rather than focusing on substance. Across all these tactics, the common thread is exploitation of the virtues that define intelligence. Logic, empathy, patience, and ethical seriousness, when untempered by contextual awareness, can be transformed into vulnerabilities. The manipulator does not need to outthink or outmaneuver their target through superior intellect. They only need to reshape the environment so that intelligence itself is no longer an advantage. Chaos replaces clarity, urgency replaces deliberation, and moral performance replaces authentic communication. Machiavelli recognized these dynamics centuries ago. His observation was not that cruelty or cunning is superior to virtue, but that virtue without awareness is exposure. The manipulator's effectiveness lies not in brilliance, but in their ability to create conditions where intelligence is displaced. The ethical, logical, and empathetic individual must therefore cultivate awareness of these patterns, distinguishing the terrain of interaction from the content of any particular exchange. Only then does intelligence become resilient, capable of navigating even the most destabilizing manipulative behavior without being hijacked by it. How the intelligent respond. The manipulator thrives because intelligence is applied to the wrong terrain. To resist, the intelligent individual must shift perspective from reactive engagement to strategic observation. Machiavelli's insight is clear. Virtue without awareness is not protection. Clarity is. The first orientation is the primacy of patterns over episodes. A single outburst, accusation, or emotional display can be misleading. What matters is consistency. By observing repeated behavior rather than reacting to isolated events, the intelligent person gains insight into the manipulator's methods, timing, and objectives. Patterns reveal intent where isolated episodes obscure it. Second is the cultivation of deliberate delay. Manufactured urgency is a manipulator's weapon, but it only works when the target succumbs. calmly asserting that a decision requires time neutralizes the tactic. The intelligent person who distinguishes genuine crises from artificial ones retains cognitive leverage. This is not procrastination, it is strategic patience, turning a manipulator's pressure into a null factor. Third is the exercise of negative capability. Accepting uncertainty, tolerating not knowing the manipulator's intentions preserves mental energy. One need not determine whether a person is consciously malicious or merely dysfunctional. Observing which interactions degrade judgment or exhaust resources provides actionable information without being drawn into the manipulator's narrative. Fourth, silence as a defensive tool. By offering neither argument nor position, the intelligent target denies the manipulator the material needed for distortion. Misrepresentation, moral posturing, and circular attacks all require engagement. Strategic silence removes the manipulator's leverage while preserving the observer's clarity. Finally, there is contextual ethical judgment. Intelligence includes ethical commitment, but ethical action is not universal. It must consider context. In a dynamic defined by bad faith, unconditional fairness or exhaustive explanation can be exploited. Machiavelli emphasizes that the prudent individual adapts virtue to circumstances. Observing the manipulative pattern allows the intelligent person to deploy integrity wisely rather than exposing themselves to repeated exploitation. In short, resisting manipulation is less about outsmarting the manipulator and more about controlling the environment and one's own responses. Awareness, pattern recognition, patience, tolerance for ambiguity, strategic silence, and context-sensitive ethics transform intelligence from vulnerability into resilience. The manipulator loses power not because the target is suspicious, but because the target has mastered the ancient art of seeing clearly, preserving sovereignty over perception, judgment, and action. The radical act of seeing clearly. Manipulation works not by defeating intelligence, but by changing the environment where intelligence operates. Emotional chaos doesn't respond to logic. Victimhood resists argument. Urgency crushes deliberation. The solution? Awareness, not paranoia, not cynicism, but disciplined observation. Ask not what someone says, but what their pattern reveals. Ask not, am I being fair, but am I being accurate? Ask not, how do I solve this, but does this situation demand resolution or only recognition? Intelligence, in this sense, is not a trait, it's a practice. And the person who masters it is harder to fool, not through suspicion, but through the oldest act of intellectual courage, the commitment to see clearly.